Begin the current Daf Mesech Beya, Daf Lamed Aleph, begin on the top line of the Amud. We're going to continue with the halachas as it relates to wood on Yom Tov. Shiur corresponds to because of the Chesed to Entim Daf Chaim Shem joining today's Daf. This we're going to discuss in today's Daf is regarding using wood on Yom Tov for firewood. What type of wood can you use? The halachas of binyan stira, of building and dismantling. In which cases one may dismantle a structure for the sake of Simchas Yom Tov. So Mekitim is the concept we're discussing today is about Chesur Mechzer, which is the idea that sometimes there could be a Tanoic opinion which was quoted, but it was quoted with words missing, and there are other words that have to be added in. Binyan stira b'Shabbos v'Yom Tov is the halacha that everyone agrees in Lamates Malach is now build and dismantle and destroy the structure. And Shabbos Yom Tov Machalik b'Shabbos as that relates to kalim, to movable items. So begin the current Daf Lamed Aleph, top line of the Amud. Says the Mishnah, Mavian Eitzim, we spoke about in the previous Mishnah regarding taking wood from a sukkah. Now we continue with the halachas of wood in another context. Mavian Eitzim, you could bring wood that's detached, min hasadeh, from the fields, that as long as it's within the tchum on Yom Tov, if it's min hamakunas, if it was gathered together in like a pile from before Yom Tov, where you already revealed your intention that you're relying on that wood, and therefore it's not muktzah, but let's say it would be scattered in the fields, there would be muktzah, that would be, you had no intention to use that, and therefore that would be prohibited. Now, umina karfaf, a karfaf is a surrounded, protected area, which is surrounded in the perimeter. That says the Mishnah, fila min hamafuzah. Then even if it's scattered inside the karfaf, it's like some type of like enclosure, like some type of yard, so that a person doesn't set aside that he's not going to use it, it's in his surrounded yard, and therefore even if it's scattered, it's considered permitted. Now, says the Mishnah, a zehu karfaf, what is considered as a karfaf? So we have two opinions. Tanakama says, kol shesamach le'ir, like Rashi says, mamash, if it's literally very close to the city, that's considered a karfaf, that's the Rabbi Yisrael, he says a different criterion. He says, kol shenechnasam le'pepesachas, if you can enter through a lock and key, then even if it's all the way at the end of the tchum, but again it's within the tchum and it's a protected area that you need a key to get in there, then it's going to be qualified as a karfaf. And again, that's what we said, it's important to know what a karfaf is, because karfaf, even when it's scattered, it's still considered like as if you're relying on what's inside of it. In contrast to a sadeh, has to be only that which is mukunas, which is gathered inside. Now, relating to this teaching, the Gemara brings an Amorag teaching that we're going to ask on from our Mishnah. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Mishmol. He says, you cannot bring wood on Yom Tov, only if it's gathered together like in a pile, from a karfaf, which is the protected area. I says the Gemara, how can you say this? Can you read our Mishnah? Well, no, it's not within our Mishnah. It says, min ha-karfaf, you could bring from a karfaf, like a closed yard, even if it's scattered. What are you telling me that from the karfaf has to be muchonas and gathered together? Says the Gemara, yes, but masnitin, our Mishnah yichidahi, it's a singular opinion, which, as we're going to quote right now, it's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who he says that Beis Hillel permits even when it's mefuzar in a karfaf. But the Rabbanon, the majority opinion, they actually disagree. And they hold that no one allows mefuzar in a karfaf. It's only mechunasin in a karfaf. And actually by the sada, one cannot bring it all even when it's gathered because it's not guarded there at all. The time like learn the Beitzah. The Beitzah we're going to quote is the Das Yachad, who he's the Tana of our Mishnah. Because it's Amr Shimon Elazar. He's the one who says this opinion. But again, the Rabbim disagree, and Rabbi Yehuda Mishmul is going like the Rabbim. Because Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, Lo nechleku b'sham b'sil alam b'zar and shabbos. B'sham b'sil, they don't disagree. When it's in the field, if it's scattered, shemavin, like we said in our Mishnah, he's the Tana of our Mishnah, that you can't bring it. When it's in the karfaf and it's gathered together, shemavin, that you could for sure bring. Aman nechleku, regarding what are they disagreeing about, which Rabbi Shimon Elazar, who he's the Tana of our Mishnah, is like Beis Hillel, is alam fazar and shebekarfaf. When it's in the karfaf, which is like in the closed area, and even if the wood is scattered throughout, or v'almachanas and shabasadis, or let's say in the fields where it's gathered together, there shebisham lo yav. Bisham says no, you still can't bring it. Or Beis says you may bring it. So what you see is that this opinion of Beis Hillel, which is according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, is the halacha of our Mishnah. that you could bring Mefuzzarim in the Karfaf, which was Reb Shimon Loza and Basil, is the halacha of Mishnah. On that, Rabbi Yehuda Mishmor was not passed like that, because that's a Das Yachid. He's ruling like the majority who disagree and say that no, even by a Karfaf, has to be Mechunas and has to be gathered together, and therefore he didn't rule like our Mishnah. Another related teaching, the Gemara brings Amar Rava, says Ali Konim, reed leaves, Vali Gefonim, and the leaves of vines, Avagav de Mechanfilu. So even though it's been gathered together from before Yom Tov, and it's staying in one place, but Kivin di Madli Zika, since the wind would blow, Mavadlu would scatter it, so Kimufuzar Damu Vasurin. So therefore it's like scattered, as Rashi says, even if the wind did not scatter it, and it's going to be forbidden, because we could presume a person would not rely on it, because he thinks the wind is going to blow it away. Like we said, when things are scattered, like the way we were saying, Rabbi Mishmor, we rule even in the Karfaf, it has to be Mechunasim, because you're also not really thinking about using it, it's all scattered all over. So here, even if it was gathered, it's like it's scattered, because the wind's going to blow it, and it's going to be scattered all around, and therefore, it's going to be forbidden. Now, but from beforehand, from yesterday, you already placed a vessel of something heavy on those leaves to weigh it down, Shabbatami, well, that's going to be okay. You're going to have to use it in Yom Tov, because then you are Semechdas, then you are relying on it, because you know it's not going to fly away, because you put something heavy on it from before Yom Tov. Now, we said in the Mishnah that Ezehu Karfa Fechulu. We said, what's considered as a Karfa Fechulu? So we had two different opinions. Either a Karfa, like Rabbi Yehuda says, is if it's Samach Lier, if this enclosure, this park, or whatever it is, this enclosed area is near the city, or Bisi says, if you need to get in with a key so it's well protected, then even if it's far away, like as long as it's within the Tchum of Shabbos, then it's going to be considered as a karfa, which again has a more lenient in halacha than that of a son. Now, Ibailu, this is a little bit complicated, but Ibailu, the following question: Heichi Kamar, what does the Mishnah say? So the Gemara starts off like this. Rabbi Yehuda, his opinion was, Kol shesamach le'ir, whatever is near the city is considered karfa. Now, but with the Islay Pesachas, is it also talking about that this karfa has a key, which therefore it's protected? And as Rashi explains a lot of the missing pieces, says, so why would Rabbi Yehuda not say that explicitly? I mean, if you're saying it's not just close to the city to be a karfa, you also have to have a key. So why didn't he say that? Because he holds that generally a karfa of someone's enclosed yard, he has a lock. And we're going on general karfifas, that, as long as it's near the city, but it has to have a lock. And that was Rabbi Shloimy was coming to say, when he said the words, that whatever you enter in with a pesachas, what he was saying was, even this with pesachas, you're right, since it has a lock, it doesn't have to be near the city. Then even if it's as long as within the tchum, it's also going to be okay. Now, Rashi also adds on now, by default then, if it doesn't have a lock, then Rabbi Yisrael would hold it has to be near the city, and then it would be permitted. From the fact that he said that the reason why it's permitted when it's not near the city, when it's, let's say, the end of the tchum, is because it has a lock, the inference is, when it's near the city, then even without a lock, would also be permitted. And hence he was lenient by both of the halachas, meaning Yehuda requires both. This is the first side of the Gemara. When he says it's near the city, and it had a lock, Yehuda is saying, no, as long as a lock, it doesn't have to be near the city, it can be the other end of the tchum. Now the inference is, Beitzah says, okay, if you have a lock, it doesn't have to be nearby. But if it is nearby, then you don't need a lock. It's enough to have one of them. That's option number one. Ideal, well, maybe no. This is what Rabbi Yehuda was saying. Kol shesamach le'ir, the Tanakh Rabbi Yehuda was saying that the primary reasoning of karfaf that we're lenient is as long as it's near the city. And therefore, it's bein the isle pesachas, bein the less pesachas. Rabbi Yehuda was not making dependent all of it has a lock. Yard lock, no lock, as long as near the city. The us Rabbi Yisrael, that's what Yisrael was coming to say, that no, the reason is dependent on the lock, whether it's near the city or far from the city. And that's what he was saying. That even if it's the end of the tchum, as long as it has a lock, then it's going to be permitted again, even if it's the end of the tchum, because the reasoning is not dependent on being close at all, and therefore, so it would come out that according to Beitzah, if it doesn't have a lock, even if it's near the city, he would hold it's not going to work. So that was the question: is Rabbi Yossi being maker of either one, or is he saying no? It just has nothing to do with being near the city. It has to do with a lock. You have a lock, it could be the other end of the room. You don't have a lock, it's not going to work even near the city. Says the Gemara Tashma as being a raya, because Midiktani from the words you learned in the Mishnah of Yomi, he says, whatever you enter with a lock, with a key, then even if it's at the end of the tchum, it's going to be the lenient halacha of a karfa. Shlamina says the Gemara of Yesi, Tarti Lukula Kamar, he's being lenient on both of these halachas. In other words, Rashi again explains a little of the missing words over here. From Rabbi Yesi's wording, from his halacha, you could infer and understand what Rabbi Yehuda the Tanakama did not require both. Remember, one of the options we had, option number one was, Yehuda requires both. He didn't mention about a lock, because that's how generally a karf is. We just told him that it has to be nearby and with a lock. That was option number one. On that, the Gemara is proving, no, it's not like option number one, in that way that Yehuda requires both. And to say that Rabbi Yossi is leaning on both, that is, Rabbi Yossi says, if it's nearby, you don't need a lock. If you have a lock, it doesn't have to be nearby. Why? Because he heard Rabbi Yehuda that was saying, whatever is near the city, whether it has a lock or doesn't have a lock, and that Rabbi Yossi said to him, whatever has a key, even if it's at the other end of the tchum, it's going to be okay. Now, if it's nearby, it doesn't need to have a key. How do we know that that is the maskan of the Gemara, that he held either one, not that it has to have the lock? Because if Rabbi Yossi was saying that, like option number two, that it has to be with a key, then even if it's nearby that you have to have a key, he shouldn't have said at the end, even if it's within the tchum. Rather, should have said, Rabbi Yossi says, whatever you enter with a key, that since he said kol, so we understood that it has to have a key, whether it's nearby or far. Why does he say v'fila b'toich tchum Shabbos? Rather, it's coming to tell us, because you only need the key only when it's not nearby. And therefore, since he said v'fila b'toich tchum Shabbos, he's saying, because you have a key. But if it's nearby, then you wouldn't need to have a key. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, that doesn't require both, and again, this is a mix of the two options that we said. We're saying Rabbi Yehuda does not require both, and we're saying Rabbi Yossi is leaning on both. We also know that from the first statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi said, Kol shenechnasim lo b'peisachas, whatever you enter with the key. Now, if you would say that everyone held that, meaning generally a karfaf has a pesachas, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda was actually requiring both, a lock and being nearby, then Rabbi Yossi should have just said, Shabbos. Why is he saying Kol shenechnasim lo b'peisachas? Rabbi Yehuda is also told me that it has a lock. Every conference with a lock. Obviously, that no, Rabbi Yehuda was not saying anything about a lock. It doesn't need a lock. It just has to be nearby, and therefore the Gemara concludes Shema Minah that Rabbi Yossi Tarti L'Kula Shema Minah. Rabbi Yossi saying he's leaning on either one. He says it could either be nearby without a key or far away with a key, and that would medayed from the words V'afila b'teich tchum Shabbos. That he's saying, okay, because it's far. But if it would be closer, we wouldn't even need a key. And also we infer that Rabbi Yehuda, he also doesn't require both. He only requires that it be nearby, because if he required both, that it has to have a lock, and although he didn't say it because we're assuming generally a karfaf has a lock, the Rabbi Yossi shouldn't have said his words, because he's going on the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda already said, so to speak, that it has a lock. The fact that he's saying we can infer Rabbi Yehuda does not require a lock. All required was that it should be near the city. And the Gemara concludes, in the lenient interpretation, that all you need to have is one of the two, either nearby, or if it's even b'toich tchum Shabbos at the end of the tchum, as long as there's a lock, is going to be karfaf, which again, a karfaf is the more lenient interpretation, whether it be like the halacha of Mishnah, which is das yachid, or like that of the Rabbanan, that then you could either take, like we said, from a Frizarn, or like our Mishnah, even from either Mechonosin, or like our Mishnah, even by Mifrizarn. If you know halacha, the next Mishnah, again, continue with the halachas of wood, again, but this is another halachic criterion, that of uvdin d'chayil. You're not allowed to do weekday type of activities, but again, it continues on the halachas of wood. Says the Mishnah, imavakin eitzim. Not allowed to chop wood. Loimna kairis, not from beams, which we'll see in the Gemara exactly how to translate what our Mishnah is saying. But you're not chopped from beams, and not from beams that broke on Yom Tiv. So too, that is what you're not allowed to do. Not now how you're not allowed to do. They mevakim, you cannot chop loy b'kardim, not with an axe, which Rashi tells us that generally the axe was made like a professional tool, which they would make the saddles with, which they're called aishish. Now then there were certain types of professional tools, which are called burger, where there's two ends of it. The narrow end is similar to our axes, and the second end is similar to that of those professional tools that were used to make the saddles for the horses. So you can't chop, not with an axe, not with a saw, which is a knife that's filled with indentations, which is quick to cut wood, which is also a professional tool. Again, you can't use professional tools on Yom Tov, it's like a weekday type of activity. Neither can you use a sickle, which either is dolyer or sharfa. Again, they're all professional tools, and again, it looks like you're doing malacha, therefore it's awesome. Ella b'kayfetz. Rather, if you want to chop wood on Yom Tov, what you could do is you could use a cleaver, which that's a general kayfetz is like it's basically like a butcher's knife, big fat knife, what's called like a meat cleaver, which is similar, actually, says Rashi, to the axes they had in the times of Rashi, which are not professional tools. Now, some would make that it would have two ends, and the second one was similar to actually the axe that was used to make the saddles, as it sounds like from the Gemara. But generally, those cleavers are not professional tools, and therefore it says the Mishnah, you could use a kaifetz as long as it's not a weekday type of a professional tool that looks like you're doing malacha on Yom. So that's what the Mishnah says. So now the Gemara asks, however, seems to be a contradiction. Because Ba'amar Reisha, you said in the beginning of the Mishnah, a mevakin kalal. You said, you open up the opening words in the Mishnah word. You're not allowed to chop wood, not from beams, not beams that broke on Yom Tov, but just says not allowed to chop. And the Gemara assumes that the reasoning of the Mishnah is not because of muktzah, that's why you're not allowed to chop wood, rather because of malacha and tircha. You can't be chopping wood on Yom Tov. And it sounds like that's why picking specifically the cases you brought. It says you can't chop wood, not from beams that, even when it says from beams, where Rashi translated what the words mean to say, the way the Gemara assumes right now, Leimai Kairos means even from beams that broke from before Yom Tov, and it's ready to be used as firewood, doesn't make a difference. You can't be chopping wood on Yom Tov. And so too, what's called zu, ve'ein tzarich lemazu, and that if it broke on Yom Tov, for sure, you wouldn't be able to. But you're right, we didn't have to say that, but that the Gemara is asking now, so you're saying in the Mishnah you're not chop wood at all, and then you say, just don't use the kardim, magera, magel, because those are professional tools, but you could use a kaifetz, which is unusual for wood. What do you mean? How can you use a kaifetz? I thought you're not chop wood at all. So I'm going to review the Mishnah. He says you're a chesur mechsura. There are words that are missing from our Mishnah, and this is what it's supposed to say in the Mishnah, and that is, the Gemara has a new understanding of halacha of the Mishnah. It's not like you're never allowed to chop wood because chopping wood is like a malacha and like tircha. No, the halacha of the Reish of our Mishnah was because of muktzah. Ein mavakin al chop min hasaver shel kairos. The first case in the Mishnah was if you have a pile of beams that are laying on the ground that are used for structure, for construction, so that's muktzah, because you can use it for building. You're not using it for firewood, even if you change your mind in Yom Tov. So you live like Yom Tov. You can't use a beam that broke on Yom Tov, because although right now, what are you going to do with this broken beam? You're going to use it for firewood. Yeah, but when Yom Tov started, it wasn't intended for that, and therefore it's considered as muktzah. Aval, and these are the words that are missing from the Mishnah. You could chop wood from a beam that broke from before Yom Tov, which already you're going to use it for firewood even from before Yom Tov. And that's what the Mishnah continues in the second half. Now that I know there are certain woods you could chop, when you are chopping, how can you chop? You cannot chop not with an axe, not with a sickle, not with a saw, because those are professional tools. That's uvdin d'chayil. It's only with a cleaver, which not the normal way. That's something you could use on Yom Tov. And Tana Malach is similar in the Brisa, like Shmuel, that the reason in the Mishnah why it is forbidden to chop sometimes because of muktzah, not because of malacha and tircha. Like the Brisa says explicitly, I'll chop wood, not from a pile of beams that's set aside for building. Not even from a beam that broke on Yom Tov. Because that was not considered prepared. Which obviously if it broke from before Yom Tov, which is muchan, then you could, because the halacha is based on muktzah, not because of tircha. Now the Mishnah said, one of the cases we said that you're not allowed to use was you cannot use an axe. Now the Gemara qualifies exactly when and how you could or cannot use an axe. So he says, we didn't learn el benak v'shalai. There's the nekeva and zachar. Zachar is always the smaller pointier, and the nekeva is, so here the nakvas of the axe that we said you can't use is the wide end, which they use to chop down a tree by its width, which that's very similar to a professional tree cutter, which is a meleches umen. That's considered a non-Yom Tov option. A besachar shalai, but by the narrow end of the axe, which is used to just chop wood, not to chop a tree, oh, that's mutter, that would be permitted. That's not considered as a problem of uvd nechel. So the Gemara said, pshita, obviously, because it's not. The case that we said in the Mishnah that you're allowed to use, which tool did we say you could use? You could use the meat cleaver, which, as Rashi explains, is all zachars, meaning it's a very small type of a blade. It's not this large type. So obviously when we said the axe you can't use is obviously the nakvas, is obviously the wider one. And the narrow one you could use because the meat cleaver we said you could use. And if the meat cleaver you could use, so that's the narrow blade of the axe. So why didn't you tell me that you could use that? Says, no, what would you say? Maybe when I said you could use the meat cleaver, is because it's totally zachars, meaning it's totally a small blade. But regarding a certain axe, that's a combo. It has on one side an axe blade, and the other side it has, like so to speak, the meat cleaver blade, what we call zachars, which is the narrow blade. Amos, I would say, since the wider blade, the larger one, the nakvas, is asa, haigis nam asa would say, okay, this tool is off limits. You can't even use the narrow blade. That's the chiddush that Rabbi Shloimy was telling us, in the name of Rav, that no, it depends on the blade, not on the tool, and therefore you could use the blade that is the narrow one, which is not considered as that which is usually used, because it's considered as a shinoi when you use those small blades to chop wood. Now, actually those that taught this teaching of Rav Chinna, actually a seifa on the end of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that you cannot use the axe, and you can't use the saw, and you can't use the sickle. What you could use is the meat cleaver. So that is where Amr Rav Shloimy Schwartzberg, he was qualifying Lishon el Bezachar Shalom. You could only do this, and Rashi already addressed this in the Mishnah, that certain tools they would have other blades on it too. So that he's explaining that although he said you could use the cleaver, that's because it's like a butcher's knife, that's only Bezachar Shalom on the narrow blade. A benak v'shlei, but if let's say that cleaver has a fat, wide blade, that's usher, that's forbidden. As Rashi explains in the location of Rav Chinna that it was taught on the Sefer the Mishnah, the cleavers would have a zachas and a nakvas. Like there are certain professional tools that are called bidgav, Rashi says, that have a kardim that has like an axe type of blade on the other side. So that nakvas blade would be forbidden to use. So we must have pshita, obviously. Didn't we already learn in the Mishnah that you can't use a kardim? Why? Because it's all nakvas. So obviously we can infer from there that when we let you use the cleavers, because of the zachras of it, which is the narrow blade, but the fatter, wider blade of the nakvas is going to be forbidden. Says the Gemara, what would you say? When we say it's aser by, that's a kardim when it's only an axe, which is all nakvas, all its blades are forbidden. And it's not used for chopping wood, it's used as a professional tool. Avol, but if let's say it has two ends, two blades, one is a male one, like a kaifetz, which is a narrow blade, and one is like a nakvas, like a kardim, like an axe, and it has them together. So I would say, oh, so it's obvious that it's used for chopping. And actually, migu the high geese since actually the narrow blade like that of the cleaver is permitted. So high geese namish, I would actually even say the wider blade is also should be a shina because this whole tool is used for just chopping, not for a professional tool. Kamashmalan, that's to tell you that no, this that we let you by the kaiv is only by the zachars and not by the nakfas. Continue with the next Mishnah, continue on the halachas of muktzah that we were speaking about in this in these halachas of Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah, Bayishu Moli Peris. If you have a house that's filled with produce, and on its own it caved in a part of the house. So now you could access the produce. So now you could take from the place where it caved in, and what's the chiddush? Rashi tells us you don't say that the produce is what's called muktzah machmas iser. Muktzah machmas iser is a halacha that to utilize it you would have to have a prohibited utility. You can't use it because of the iser related to it. So here also, you weren't able to open up this house on Yom Tov because it was locked and you didn't have a key. So you must see if das, because how are you going to access it? There's an isser to go ahead and use the produce. Says Rashi, no, that since opening it is not an isser deraisa, why not? Isn't that seiser to destroy, to dismantle a house? So the Gemara is actually going to tell us that we're talking about what's called bavir de livne. We're talking about where there's no cement, it's just bricks piled up one on the other, and that wouldn't be a biblical violation of seiser. So therefore, it would be at most a rabbinic prohibition. So therefore, it's not considered muktzah. As Rashi says, we find this idea by tevel, by untyped produce. The Gemara brings later on the Lamadal and the Beis that it's considered prepared by Shabbos. Why? Tevel has an isser to eat it. Yeah, because if you're over the isser derabbanan, it's only isser derabbanan because it looks like you're fixing the sakamon. It's in your you would make truma and maisus on the table. It'd be permitted to eat it. So a person's not masir das, and therefore it's not considered machmas isser. So it will be here. That's what the Tanakh is saying. And okay, so if it ends up caving in the house, so it's not considered muktzah. You go ahead and use the produce. Now Meir says even a bigger chiddush. He says He says you could even make it cave in. You can knock it open, and you can take the produce from inside, which the Gemara is going to explain right now. Why would that be? Says the Gemara, Mai. How could the mayor say that you could break down the building to get the produce that's inside? Because Sasra Allah. That's considered Seisu, one lamatas malachas, of destroying an aisle. So Rabbi Shloimy bar Ada Amar Shmuel, he says what we're talking about over here is ba'aveira delivni. We're talking about where the bricks are organized one on top of the other without cement, without clay. And therefore, it's not a biblical violation of Seiser, it's at most a rabbinic. Says, is that really so? But Nachman said, he says you have a different problem, he says. Because even if you have bricks that are left over from construction after you finish building, it's not even made like a wall, it just happened to be a pile one on the other. Then you're allowed to move it, you're allowed to carry it on Shabbos, because now you're not using it for construction anymore. Rather, it's meaning it's just laying around these bricks. Because ultimately you could lay on them, and therefore they have halachic status like a kli. It's not considered as muktzah. But if sharginu, and this is the case we're asking from, but let's say you had piled them up, the bricks one on top of the other, then you revealed your intention that v'adiaktzinu, you're for sure setting it aside for construction. You're still going to use it for building. I mean, if they're just laying over there afterwards, that's not muktzah because no one's using it anymore. And you could use it as a kli to lay on. But if it was piled up in a pile, it's set aside for construction, and that would be forbidden to be moved because it has a muktzah status and the fact that you're not going to use it for anything else, whether it be kiss or whatever it is. But the point is, you're still going to use it for building. And our Mishnah is saying that it's also going to be, even if you're going to say it's rabbinic isser, but how you let him move it? You're saying you let him break through it. There's no problem about seiser because although it's okay, it's a rabbinic isser. We'll see shortly why that would be permitted, but it still has a problem about muktzah. How you let him move it, even if you just pile it up, not even part of a wall, it's muktzah for sure over here. So Rabbi Zeir says yes, but b'yomtiv amru. Our Mishnah, when your mayor permitted to take apart the wall, was on yomtiv. So since it's only rabbinically forbidden, whether it be because of seiser rabbinically or muktzah rabbinically, but because of simchas yomtiv. So Remeir held that the Rabbanan Chacham were matir, this issue of muktzah, because of eichel nefesh, because you want to get the food inside. You're right. But on Shabbos, you wouldn't be able to even move it like Rav Nachman because it would be considered as muktzah, because even if you just pile up bricks as muktzah, for sure when it's part of the wall, you wouldn't be able to move those bricks. And Tanei is in the Beitzah. He says, this that he says in Halacha Mishnah, you could even take it apart, the wall, initially take the produce that's inside. But Yom Tov, it says on Yom Tov because it's Simchas Yom Tov. Avaloi b'Shabbos, but you can't do this on Shabbos. Now, in a related teaching related to this idea of Seiser that we spoke about in the Mishnah, as relates specifically to Yom Tov, Sama Shmuel. Shmuel says the following halacha. He says, Chaysama shebekarka, regarding seals and covers of that are on the ground. For example, the doors that open up to a pit or a cave, which are closed with knotted ropes. So there's the following halacha. So mater, you could untie the knot, because Rashi tells us there's two malachas we're going to talk about here: kosher and mater, and bain and seiser. So regarding untying the knot, so that's not a problem because it's not a kasher shel kayama. Those knots are not meant to remain there forever because it's always used to open and close. So although they knot it, so you could untie that knot, but avolim avkia. But actually, you cannot unravel the rope to take apart the thickness and the weaving of the rope. And neither can you cut the rope, because that's actually going to be stira. It's going to be demolishing because it's considered part of the structure. And binyan shel karka, which is what the rope is part of, is considered saisa. So therefore, although you can untie the rope, you can't unravel it and you can't cut it. Now, where shebekalim, but if let's say we're talking about a box that was closed through a knotted rope, there mater you could untie it, and the mafki you could unravel it, and the chaytich and you could cut it, because there's no stira bekalim. Since it's a kli, it's a vessel, there's no halacha of demolishing, of dismantling by a vessel. So there the rope you could. And says Shmuel echad Shabbos v'echad Yom Tov. This halacha applies by Shabbos and on Yom Tov. However, the Gemara asks on Shmuel Meisrei from the following brayso. The brayso says, Chaysama shebekarka. Same case Shmuel was talking about. If you have these seals in the ground, the Shabbos matter, on Shabbos you could untie the rope. So far that's the same thing like Shmuel had said, but you cannot unravel it and you cannot cut it. But the problem is, the brayso is saying that's only on Shabbos. But Yom Tov, on Yom Tov, says the brayso, mater umavkiya v'chaytich. You could untie, you could unravel, and you could cut it. So obviously you see that the seals that are knotted is not biblical stira, and because you see in Yom Tov you're allowed to, according to the brayso, it's only on Shabbos, rabbinically it's going to be forbidden. So that contradicts Shmuel, who he was saying that no, he says Shabbos and Yom Tov are the same thing, that you cannot unravel it, you cannot cut it. So we see in the brayso that you could. Says the Gemara, Hamani, who's the time that this brayso is Remeiri, who, as you recall from our Mishnah, the moment that he says, he says, yeah, this is only rabbinically forbidden, and therefore, you're right, it's only an Issa D'Rabbanan, and Remeir said you're allowed to do on Yom Tov, for Simchas Yom Tov, so therefore, just like it says, he says you're allowed to even demolish the wall and take it, so he says you're allowed to do rabbinic stira, and here it's also a rabbinic stira. So therefore, as you just proved to me from the brayso, that yes, on Yom Tov you're allowed to, but that's Remeir. But the Rabbanah, they disagree in our Mishnah, and they said that even though we're talking about very delivni, even though we're talking about a wall that there's no cement and just bricks, which only rabbinic seiser, what did the Rabbanan say? They said, no, you can only take it if it fell apart by itself. You're not actively take it apart. Oh, and I say like Rabbanan. Therefore, when I quoted this halacha, I said it doesn't make a difference Shabbos or Yom Tov, but not more mekel for Simchas Yom Tov to do rabbinic stira, and therefore you're not allowed to take apart these ropes. You're right; these ropes are not biblical seiser by unraveling it, even though it's part of the ground. It's only rabbinically; it's not a real stira, and therefore. But I said you're not allowed because I'm going to Rabbanan. The problem is the Gemara still asks and says, "Umi plig Rabbanan leba chesama shebekarka." Did Rabbanan really disagree by the seals in the ground? To say that over there you are allowed, that you're not allowed to go ahead and take it apart. But by the time you learn the brayso, it says in the brayso clearly, I agree to Remeir, When you have these seals, these knots in the ground that are closing those wells, Shabbos matter. On Shabbos you're allowed to untie it, but you're not allowed to unravel it and you're not allowed to cut it. But Yom Tiv matter mavkiya b'chaytech. It says clearly the Rabban agree that in Yom Tiv you're allowed to untie it and unravel it and cut it. That's not like Shmuel. Shmuel said his teaching that, I'm like the Rabban. They say you can't do rabbinic stira even on Yom Tiv. And if you're not unraveling, I'll cut it. The Bryce says clearly, Rabban agreed or maybe you're allowed to do that to the ropes of these seals in the ground. Says the Gemara, you're right, as we continue to talk about the Beitzah Daf, but who? Shmuel, that he had said previously that even on Yom Tov you're not allowed to unravel, the Amar Ki Hai Tana. He's going like a different Tana, who says that even by the seals in the ground, even on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to unravel. The Tana learned the Brysa. The seals of the ground, matter, you're allowed to untie. You're not allowed to unravel, you're not allowed to cut it. Echad Shabbos ve'echad Yom Tiv. So you're right, although there are a Rabbanan that agree to Rameir, but there is a third Tana who Shmuel's going like that says, no, on Yom Tiv, you're not allowed to, even on Yom Tiv, you're not allowed to unravel, you're not allowed to cut it. Now, the Beitzah continues, which actually we're going to ask on this in a moment, B'Shabikli. Now, regarding a knotted rope on a vessel, b'Shabbos matter, on Shabbos allowed to untie it. Avalei mafki b'chaytech, but you cannot unravel it, you cannot cut it. B'Yom Tiv matter mafki b'chaytech, you're allowed to untie it, unravel it, and you're allowed to cut it. So says the Gemara, okay, wait a second. Tiratzalach reisha. You answered the first statement of Shmuel regarding his teaching of chesamis of the seals in the ground, where you supported from this Tana, who says like him that even on Yom Tiv, you cannot unravel, you cannot cut. Problem is, it'll save a kasha. But now this same Tana that you're trying to support him from, the end of his teaching now of Shmuel is difficult. Because what did Shmuel say by the knotted ropes of Kalim? He said that even on Shabbos, not only could you untie, you could unravel and you could cut, because he said there's no steer b'Kalim. So you could even unravel it and you could even cut it on Shabbos. This Tana said, by the ropes of Kalim, on Shabbos you could untie, but you cannot unravel, you cannot cut it. So although you supported Shmuel from this Tana, but the Seif is difficult on Shmuel regarding the ropes of Caleb. So says the Gemara, it's not difficult, because Hamami, who is the Tana of this Brisa? In other words, the truth is, yes, you're allowed to unravel and you're allowed to cut, because there's no steer b'Kaleb. This Tana itself, that would hold that if you could unravel it and you could detach it with your hands, it would be permitted. Why is the Tana saying it's forbidden? That's because of the moving of the knife to use to unravel or to cut it. Because who is the Tana of this Brisa? Is Reb Nechemiah. The Amma that he says, and it's brought in Masechta Zever, Daf Yomi and Aleph, Kol HaKelim, any tool, any utensil, even a spoon, even a talus, even a jacket, whatever it is, Ein Nitolin Ela Derech Tashmishin. They could only be moved for the purpose of what its utility was designated for. So let's say a knife was made for eating, not for, let's say, cutting open a seal. So it's for that reason that Reb Nechemiah is saying you cannot unravel and you cannot cut it, because you're going to be you can't use a professional tool, so you can use a knife. No, Reb Nechemiah says you cannot use a knife for anything but cutting food, which is what it's made for. And that's why you cannot unravel and you cannot cut. Shmuel, who says that you could cut and unravel, he's like this Tana who holds you're allowed to really technically do it because there's no steer b'Kalem. He doesn't hold Reb Nechemiah in regards to this idea that you're not allowed to use a tool, because Reb Nechemiah is the only one that says like this for that purpose, but it's not really contradicting the essence of Shmuel's teaching. Reb Nechemiah agrees you're allowed to cut and unravel, you just can't use a tool. You can't use a knife or anything else, but that Shmuel doesn't know like him. Says the Gemara, wait a second. Reb Nechemiah, if it really is Reb Nechemiah, Ma'ir Shabbos, then why are you telling me that on Shabbos by a kli you're not allowed to go ahead and be mafkiya v'chaytich? Why? Because you now move the knife for something it's not meant for. I feel Yom Tov Nami. Then even Yom Tov you should not be allowed to by the kli be mafkiya and chaytich, which he says by Yom Tov you could do. And Chitim, if you're going to say, oh, Shalom Nechemiah differentiates between Shabbos, the Shabbos Yom Tov, meaning by moving something like a knife for something that's not its own purpose, which is rabbinic isser. Oh, Reb Nechemiah wasn't so machmer by muktzah, by moving something in Yom Tov like it was on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, oh, Mishan, does he really differentiate? But we're going to bring you a three-way contradiction, which we're going to say it's three different times. I'm going to prove from there Reb Nechemiah holds the same thing as Yom Tov as it is by Shabbos. Because we learned one brisa that says, Masikim Mekalim. You're allowed to fuel a fire with a vessel, like you're allowed to take a bowl and throw it into the flames on Yom Tiv, where, because a bowl is something that's a movable item, and it's also, you can move it to throw it into the fire. But you cannot fuel a fire with a broken bowl, let's say, which broke on Yom Tiv, because since it broke now, it's not fit to use for anything, and if it's muktzah, and that it's fit for using for fuel a fire, well, yesterday by Ben Moshe it wasn't designated for that, and for that it is considered muktzah. So the first brisa says you could fuel with a keli, but not with a broken keli. Brisa number 2 said, Masikin you could fuel, Bema kelim, Bema shubikelim, no, you could use regular kli, broken kli, because as Rashi points out, this time it doesn't hold the muktzah, at least in its general category. So even if it wasn't prepared like a broken vessel, it's okay, you could use that. A third brisa that says, Masikin now fuel a fire, loy bekelim, not with a vessel, because this time it holds, it can only be moved for its designated utility, which is, let's say, eating cereal, not for fueling a fire. And for sure, you cannot use broken vessel because that's noiled. It's a new entity, it was not around for fuel from before Yom Tov. But one thing is, we see a three-way contradiction. Either you could use keli and not shibikelim, or you could use kelim and shibikelim, or you can't use not kelim, not shibikelim. So Mishani, we answered like Kash, it's not difficult. There's 3 different Tanoim. The first brisa is Rabbi Yehuda, who holds the law as a muktzah. So keli, which was it's usable, so you could use it for fuel, but not shibikelim, which was like night. Rabbi Shimon, the second brisa, Rabbi Shimon, who doesn't hold the law as a muktzah, you could use kelim and shibikelim. The third brisa is Rabbi Nechemia, who says you can't use kelim and shibikelim. Why? Because Rabbi Nechemia is telling us that on Yom Tiv, it's going to be muktzah, because even though it's a keli, you cannot use it for its non-tashmish designation. Now, what are we talking about over here? Yom Tiv, because you can't obviously fuel a fire on Shabbos. So you see, Nechemia does not differentiate in his halacha of muktzah that you can't take, let's say, a knife to unravel a rope, not just on Shabbos, but on Yom Tiv. So back to the question that how can you say that it's from Nechemia, and he's saying that by a kli on Yom Tov you'd be able to, but not on Shabbos. What's the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov? You see, it doesn't differentiate. Says the Gemara, trei Tanoim v'lu Rabbi Nechemia. You're right. It's 2 different Tanoim in what Rabbi Nechemia held. One of them holds that there's a difference between a shvus of Shabbos and a shvus of Yom Tov. That was the time of the brisa that we brought a few lines before that does differentiate. Regarding a kli, when you have the rope on it, if you're allowed to unravel it or cut it, he differentiated over there. He said Shabbos you can't and Yom Tov you could. Because he agreed to Shmuel that you're allowed to go ahead and because there's no steer b'kelim, you're allowed to unravel it out of the touch. You just can't use a knife, not for its designated purpose. Yom Tov is Meko. That's one version of the Chem. There's another one who we just brought right now, who says, oh, on Yom Tov you can't use kelim or shibikelim, even though it's Yom Tov, because it does not differentiate. That's 2 different Tanoim according to Rabbi Nechemia, what the halach is, and therefore it's not a stira, it's 2 different Tanoim. Thank you to any time for hosting us.